Hello and welcome to Beyond the Headlines, the show that delves past the surface story to give you in-depth analysis of the major issues and topics being discussed statewide, nationally, and even globally. I'm your host, Justin Chenette. We are here at the State Capitol building where we asked Secretary of State Deb Markowitz about her unsuccessful bid for the Democratic primary for governor and her position and role over the years as Secretary of State. Take a look. Secretary Markowitz, you have served as Secretary of State since 1998. Describe your day-to-day activities and responsibilities and how maybe it has changed over the years.
I was elected in 1998 and took office in 1999, and things have really changed quite a bit in this office over that 12 years. We oversee the elections. We license 44 different professions. We oversee all of the business regulation. And we have the State Archives and Public Records Department. We also have a couple of other programs. One, we're the place that people come with questions about marriages and the kinds of paperwork that you need when you're having adoptions and so forth. And we have a program that protects victims of domestic violence, rape, and stalking from being tracked down through public records. So we do a variety of things. Also, we help our local communities get their jobs done. The biggest change that I've seen over the 12 years that I've been in office is how much we now rely on the computer. When I first was elected, we barely had a website, and the website was just a list of links to paper documents, and there were maybe 40 documents you could pull up online. Now we've got a website that gets 10,000 visitors every week. Using our databases, looking up information about notaries or finding out how to get registered or how to vote in Vermont, looking up businesses. You want to start a business, you want a trade name, you want to make sure somebody else doesn't have the name, or looking up a professional. You want to go see a dentist, want to make sure they've got a clean bill of health themselves from the regulatory perspective. So that's been, I would say, the major changes, how we interact with the public, how we do business. The public now wants to do it all online, and we've given it to them.
You were the first woman to be elected in the position of Vermont Secretary of State. What does that mean to you both personally and professionally?
Well, when I ran for office, I hadn't thought about that at all. It hadn't occurred to me that I'd be a first. And, you know, as the students in your school can imagine, it's amazing there's still firsts like that. So I didn't run to be a woman Secretary of State. I ran because I felt like I would be the best person for the job. But I'll tell you, I do believe it's important to have women involved in positions of leadership. And that's because we bring a different perspective. We bring our life experience to the table. And it's important to have men in office, but it's also important to have women. Here's an example of why being a woman can make a difference. In the first month or so of being in office, there was a tragedy in Burlington where there was a woman who had moved to Burlington to escape an abuser who was being let out of jail in Springfield, Massachusetts. And he tracked her down through the public record system and shot her. And so all the victims advocates came to my office and said, Deb, we've got to do something about it, because one of my jobs is to be the standard bearer for open government. I'm the person who talks about, you know, what access you can have as a member of the public to meetings and to documents. And, you know, they came and said, look, this is life or death. We've got to find a way to close these records. My role, of course, is to say, no, the records have to stay open. So we put together a working group and came up with a program, Safe at Home program, which allows victims of domestic violence, abuse, or stalking to use our office address as their legal address in all the public records. And then we forward their mail to a confidential location. So it gives them safety and security while keeping our records open. And it's because as a woman, I know what it's like to be afraid of abuse. You know, I'll tell you, as a woman, when I go to my car at night in a dark parking lot, I look in the back seat before I get in. And I would say that most men probably, it's never occurred to them to do that. And that's the difference in life experience. And because of that, we went the extra mile to make sure there was a solution to this kind of problem.
Have you faced any staunch challenges that really stand out in your mind that have really challenged you personally and your leadership?
Well, one of the things I'm passionate about is public participation. I believe it's my job to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And so I'm always looking for ways to make it easier for people to participate in elections. And one of the things that I championed some years ago was election day registration. States like Maine and Minnesota and Connecticut have laws in place that allow somebody to come into the polls on election day, register right then, and then vote. Because registration is a barrier. It's a bureaucratic barrier to voting. And so I worked together with some of our town clerks and brought in a proposal for election day registration, which passed the Senate with no problem. But then in the House, the rest of the clerks, a whole bunch of clerks came and said, no, this is a disaster. This would be horrible because it would be complicated for us on election day. And that was a challenge for me because it's something that I believed wasn't really going to be that hard to put into place. But I had to face the reality that the people running the elections on the front line were afraid of it. They were afraid of making a mistake and having it affect the elections, and they weren't ready to go there. So it was a challenge, but I backed off of it and actually put together a 2-day retreat where I brought many of the clerks around the table with some of the election activists like the League of Women Voters and Common Cause to talk about what other solutions would be available. And as a result, we made some really good changes to the law that made it easier to vote and harder to cheat. Not election day registration, but it gets us closer.
The Vermont legislature approved a Marriage Equality Act permitting same-sex marriage in Vermont, which took effect September 1st in 2009. Do you support the bill, and how have you been involved in its implementation as a law?
Well, I'm a strong supporter of marriage equality. I just believe it's a basic civil right. I actually was around when they first passed civil unions, and I'm the person who implements these laws. So I saw firsthand what a difference it made to people, to families, to be able to come to Vermont or folks living in Vermont, the ability to enter into a civil union. And it seemed silly to me that we had marriage with a different name. It's kind of this separate but equal idea. And so I was very pleased when we went the whole way and changed our civil union law to just a civil marriage law. I have implemented it, and so we get calls from people, not quite every day, but certainly every week, people who want to come to Vermont to get a marriage, or people who are in Vermont who maybe they've got a civil union and they want to know how do they upgrade to marriage, what's required. And so it's been a pleasure. I'm proud of Vermont, proud that we're the first in the country to, by legislative act, pass this important civil rights legislation.
One of your many responsibilities is to oversee elections. Have you seen a pattern in Vermont voting turnouts, and what do you expect the voting turnout to be in this upcoming election based on the results of the primary election turnout?
So the pattern that I observe with election turnout is that in a presidential year, we get our highest turnout. And that's because there's the most attention on the race and there's the most interest from the nationally down to locally. And so we'll get the biggest turnout in a presidential year. And then in the off year, the midterm election, which is what we're having right now, the turnout will depend on what's on the ballot. So in a year when there's no open seats, when it's all incumbents running for re-election, you'll have a lower turnout than a year like this year, where there's a lot of open seats. The higher up the open seat is, the more the turnout will be. And so the fact that there's a contested election for the governor's race will bring out the vote. And we saw that in our primary. We had an unprecedented turnout for a state primary in this past August. And so I expect we'll have a strong turnout as well. Now, sadly, that means 65% of the eligible voters voting. So it's not 70%, 80%, but that's still considered a high turnout in an off-year election.
Do you know what the percentage numbers were for the primary election?
I don't remember. I think it was like 28%, which is quite high for a primary.
Oh, really?
Well, understand that a primary is different than a general election. The primary is a nominating process. Mm-hmm. It's how the political parties decide who their candidates are. And so as a result, it's a much smaller number of people who are involved at that level.